As Morgan crossed the street, Bob noticed him. A man in jeans, walking alone at dusk, seemed suspicious to him. Bob didn't recognize Morgan's face. He wasn't a movie buff, and his TV was tuned to sports channels only. To him, Morgan was just another subject of interest. He flicked on his headlights and slowly followed. Morgan sensed he was being watched. It wasn't a new feeling. He'd experienced this many times in his life. But something in the air made him wary. He paused at a newsstand, pretending to read headlines, and caught sight of the patrol car parking a few yards away. The door opened, and Bob stepped out, adjusting his belt with its holster. "Good evening," Bob said, his voice formal but laced with condescension. "Where you headed?" Morgan turned slowly, his eyes meeting Bob's. He noticed the officer's hand resting near his gun, not threateningly, but enough to signal who was in charge. "Good evening, officer," Morgan replied calmly, his voice deep and measured as always. "Just walking to my hotel. Nice evening for it, don't you think?" Bob frowned. He'd expected a different reaction, nervousness, perhaps, or defiance. But this man was too calm, too composed. "I need to see your ID," Bob said, stepping closer. "We've had some robberies in this area lately. Just checking." Morgan sighed but kept his composure. He knew this wasn't about robberies. It was about him being an elderly black man in a neighborhood where Bob thought he didn't belong. But instead of arguing, Morgan slowly reached for his wallet. "Here," he said, handing over his driver's license. Bob took the ID, but his gaze lingered on Morgan. Something about this man made him uneasy, though he couldn't place why. He stepped back to his car to run the information through his radio. As he waited for a response, a young woman in her 30s approached from the nearby coffee shop. Her name was Emily, a barista who'd just finished her shift. She'd watched the scene unfold from the shop's window. "Officer, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. This man wasn't doing anything. Bob turned, his face darkening. "Mind your business, ma'am," he said curtly. "Go back to work." Emily didn't back down. She crossed her arms. "I know this man," she said. "That's Morgan Freeman." "Are you serious?" Bob froze. The name sounded familiar, but he wasn't sure. He glanced at the ID in his hand, then at Morgan, who stood with the same calm smile. "Morgan Freeman?" Bob repeated, his voice less certain. "The actor." "Yes, the same one," Emily replied, her tone sharp. "And he's definitely not a robber." Morgan raised a hand to calm her. "It's all right," he said softly. "The officer is just doing his job." But Bob felt the ground shift beneath him. He hadn't recognized Morgan, but now that the name was spoken, he remembered. The face, the voice, the movies. His cheeks flushed, but he wasn't ready to back down. Instead, he doubled down to regain control. "This isn't about who he is," Bob muttered. "We have procedures. I have the right to check anyone." "The right?" Morgan echoed quietly, his voice almost a whisper, but heavy with meaning. "What about respect? You stopped me because I was walking on the sidewalk. Is that a crime?" Bob opened his mouth, but found no words. A small crowd began to gather, a few passers-by, a couple of coffee shop patrons. They whispered, some recording on their phones. The tension grew, and Bob felt the situation slipping from his grasp. Emily turned to Morgan. "You don't have to put up with this," she said. "This is wrong." Morgan looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude but also wisdom. "I know," he replied, "but sometimes the best way to change something is not to shout, but to speak." He turned back to Bob. "Officer, I don't want conflict, but I want you to think about why you stopped me, and what would have happened if I weren't who I am." Bob clenched his jaw. He knew Morgan was right, but admitting it meant admitting fault. And Bob Kelly didn't like admitting fault. He handed back the ID. "You're free to go," he said sharply. "But don't think this is over." Morgan took the ID, nodded, and walked away without another word. But his words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Emily watched him go, her eyes gleaming with indignation and respect. Bob returned to his car, his hands trembling with anger and shame. The next morning, Atlanta buzzed like a hive disturbed by a thrown stone. The video of the incident, captured by bystanders, hit the internet and went viral within hours. Posts with the hashtag Justice for Morgan multiplied like wildfire, with comments ranging from outraged calls for justice to heated debates about the role of police in society. Local TV stations like WSB-TV dedicated entire segments to the incident, inviting civil rights experts and retired officers for analysis. National outlets CNN, The New York Times, The Washington Post began calling Morgan, pleading for exclusive interviews. At the coffee shop where Emily worked, customers could talk of nothing else. Some were furious at Bob's behavior, calling it a blatant example of racial profiling. Others, mostly older patrons, defended the officer, insisting that the police are just doing their job and that everyone gets checked in a bad neighborhood. But even they admitted, stopping Morgan Freeman, a man whose name was synonymous with dignity and wisdom, was absurd. Emily stood behind the counter, mixing a latte, but her mind was far from work. She replayed the scene in her head. Morgan's calm, Bob's tense glare, the crowd's whispers. She was frustrated that the incident had become a media sensation, yet proud that she hadn't stayed silent. Her co-worker, a young man named Devin, approached, holding his phone. "You seen this?" he said, showing an X post. Someone uploaded another video from a different angle. You can hear the officer muttering to himself after Morgan left. Emily leaned closer. The video showed Bob getting into his car, his face flushed, his lips moving. His voice was low, but the words were clear. Celebrity or not, the rules are the same for everyone. Emily clenched her fists. "He doesn't even get what he did wrong," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "This isn't about rules. It's about him." Devin sighed. "Guys like him never change," he said. "It's easier for them to blame everyone else than to look in the mirror." Emily wasn't as pessimistic, but Devin's words made her think. She remembered Morgan saying that the best way to change something was to speak. But could you speak to someone who didn't want to listen? Meanwhile, Bob sat in his cramped office at the police precinct, scrolling through news feeds on his phone. His name hadn't been released publicly yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The video was everywhere, and with each hour, the pressure grew. His colleagues, who usually joked with him in the break room, avoided his gaze today. Some whispered behind his back, and Bob caught snippets. "How do you not recognize Morgan Freeman?" And he brought this on himself. It irritated him more than the headlines. Bob tossed his phone onto the desk and rubbed his temples. He hadn't slept, replaying every second of that evening in his mind. He tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing, that it was a routine check, that he hadn't meant to offend anyone. But Morgan's words, "Why did you stop me?" haunted him. They seeped into his thoughts like a slow drizzle through a leaky roof. The more he thought, the more his certainty crumbled. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was his boss, Captain Linda Gray. Linda, a woman in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and a sharp gaze, was known for her strict but fair approach. She entered without invitation and sat across from Bob, folding her hands on the desk. "Kelly, what was that yesterday?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. You stopped Morgan Freeman for no reason. And don't tell me about robberies. I saw the video." Bob clenched his fists under the desk, feeling his throat tighten. "I was following protocol," he replied, trying to sound confident. "We had reports of suspicious activity in that area. He was alone, late at night. I was just checking." Linda cut him off, raising a hand. "Save it, Bob. You know this wasn't about robberies. The whole world knows it. You've put the department in a bad spot. And yourself, too." Bob felt heat rising to his face. He hated being made to feel guilty, especially when he thought he was just doing his job. "So what? I'm the bad guy now because I checked someone," he snapped. "I do this every day. Why is this one such a big deal?" Linda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "It's not about the fact that you checked someone," she said, her voice sharper. "It's about why. And if you can't answer that honestly, you need to ask yourself if you belong in that uniform." She leaned back, her gaze softening but not losing its edge. "Bob, I know you're a good cop. You've put in 20 years on this job. But you're not perfect. And if you're not ready to admit you screwed up yesterday, that's going to be a problem. For all of us." Bob stayed silent. He wanted to argue, to yell, to prove he was right. But Morgan's words kept looping in his head like a stuck record. "Why did you stop me? What would have happened if I weren't who I am?" He looked away, feeling his pride wrestle with the growing shame inside him. Linda stood, but added before leaving, "I'm putting you on desk duty until we sort this out. And I want you to think, Bob. Really think. Because next time, I might not have a choice but to suspend you." She left, leaving Bob alone with his thoughts. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the precinct parking lot. The sun shone brightly, but to Bob, the world felt dim. He didn't know what to do, but for the first time in years, he felt his usual answers weren't enough. Meanwhile, Morgan sat in his hotel room, scrolling through messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who'd seen the video. His phone buzzed with calls, but he answered only one, from Emily, who called to apologize for what happened and share her concerns. "Mr. Freeman, I still can't believe this happened," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and shame. "I feel like I could have done more. Said more." Morgan smiled, though she couldn't see it. He sat in an armchair by the window, holding a cup of herbal tea that gave off a faint chamomile scent. "Emily, you did exactly what was needed," he replied, his voice warm and soothing. "You spoke up. You didn't look away. That's more than a lot of people do." "But it's not enough," she countered. "People online are demanding that officer be fired. And I don't know if that's right. I want things to change. I want this to stop happening." Morgan nodded, his fingers tapping the armrest. He'd heard this before, the anger, the frustration, the desire for quick fixes. But he also knew real change took time and patience. "Change doesn't come from anger, Emily," he said. "Anger can spark a fire, but it burns out fast. Change comes from understanding, from conversations, and I intend to help that officer understand." Emily fell silent, surprised by his words. "You want to talk to him?" she asked, unable to hide her shock. "After everything he did?" "Especially because of that," Morgan replied. "If I don't talk, who will? Someone has to start. And I'm willing to be that someone." He paused, then added, "But I can't do it alone. I need people like you, Emily. People who aren't afraid to speak. People who believe tomorrow can be better than today." Emily felt her eyes well up. She didn't see herself as a hero, but Morgan's words gave her a sense of purpose. "I'll try," she said softly. "I promise." "That's all I ask," Morgan replied. After the call, he walked to the window, looking out at the city waking to a new day. The streets hummed with cars, people hurried about their business, and Atlanta felt both familiar and foreign. Morgan knew this incident was just a drop in the ocean, but he also believed a single drop could create ripples. And he was ready to make those ripples as wide as possible. A week after the incident, a local community organization focused on racial justice announced an open forum at Atlanta's community center. The goal was ambitious: to bring together residents, police activists, and politicians to discuss bias in law enforcement and find ways to address it. The organizers invited Morgan to speak, and he agreed, but with one condition: Officer Bob Kelly had to be there, not as a defendant, but as a participant in the dialogue. When Captain Linda Gray relayed the invitation to Bob, he took it as a slap in the face. The thought of sitting in a room full of people who saw him as a racist made his stomach churn. He imagined the headlines, the snarky online comments, the judgmental looks from colleagues. His first instinct was to refuse, to tell Linda he'd rather retire than subject himself to this humiliation. But Linda was unwavering. "You're going, Bob," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And you're going to listen. Not for Morgan, not for me, not for the press. For yourself. If you want to stay in that uniform, you need to prove you're better than the man in that video." Bob clenched his teeth, but nodded. He knew he had no choice. But deep down, he felt this wasn't just about his job. It was about something bigger, about who he was and who he wanted to be. That evening, the forum drew over 300 people, more than the organizers expected. The community center, an old building with high ceilings and a wooden floor, was packed to capacity. The air smelled of coffee mixed with the faint scent of wax from the freshly polished floor. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of attendees, and the hum of voices, whispers, laughter, nervous chatter created an atmosphere of anticipation. On the stage stood a simple wooden table, a few chairs, and a microphone, with a banner behind them reading, "Listen, learn, change." The words were simple, but in the context of this evening, they felt almost sacred. Morgan entered the hall a few minutes before the start, and the chatter fell silent, as if someone had muted the room. People clapped, some stood, others simply stared at him with awe. His presence was magnetic, not because of his fame, but because of the quiet dignity he exuded. He raised a hand to quiet the applause and took a seat on the stage, folding his hands in his lap. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on individual faces, young and old, black and white, angry and hopeful. Bob sat in the third row, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the room was cool. He'd chosen a seat far from the stage, hoping to go unnoticed, but he still felt like everyone knew who he was. A few people glanced at him, whispering to their neighbors. Bob clenched his jaw, trying to keep his anger in check. "I'm here, like they wanted," he thought. "But that doesn't mean I agree with them." The forum opened with a moderator, an elderly woman named Rosa Parks. Not that Rosa Parks, but her name drew smiles from the crowd. She was a local activist, known for her tireless work for the community. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat braid, and her thin-framed glasses gave her the look of a strict but kind teacher. "We're here not to blame," Rosa began, her voice strong despite her age. "We're here to listen, to share, to find a way forward. It won't be easy, but if we don't start, we'll never get there." She shared the forum's purpose and a few stories from her own life, about her brother being stopped by police for no reason, about her children's fear of walking to school because of prejudice. Her words were raw, and the room listened breathless. Then she handed the floor to Morgan. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He approached the microphone, but didn't stand behind the podium. choosing instead to stand in the center of the stage, as if speaking to each person individually. "I'm not here to accuse," he began, his voice filling the room like a warm wave. "I'm not here to shout or demand. I'm here to tell a story, my story, and maybe yours." He recounted the incident, but not with anger, with deep sorrow. He described how he felt when he saw the patrol car, how his heart tightened with a familiar fear, how he forced himself to stay calm even as emotions churned inside. He spoke of what it's like to be stopped for no reason, to feel your dignity questioned, to have to prove your right to be where you are. "I'm not the first this has happened to," he said, "and sadly I won't be the last. But I believe we can change this story. Not with shouts, not with blame, but with conversations, with understanding, with respect." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "I don't believe the officer who stopped me is a bad person," he continued, and the room fell silent. "I believe he's a person, and people make mistakes. People act on instincts that sometimes cloud their judgment, and people can change, but they have to want to." Bob felt his heart pound. He'd expected accusations, attacks, public shaming. But Morgan's words were different. They didn't excuse him, but they didn't condemn him either. They challenged him. Bob lowered his gaze, feeling his pride and shame wrestle within him. Morgan looked directly at him, and their eyes met. The room seemed to vanish, leaving just the two of them. "I'd like to invite Officer Kelly to the stage," Morgan said, his voice calm but firm. "Not to judge him, but to talk." The room froze. Bob felt every eye turned to him. His hands trembled, his throat dry. He wanted to stand and leave, to hide, to disappear. But something, maybe Morgan's words, maybe Linda's gaze from across the room, maybe a tiny spark within himself, made him stand. His legs felt like lead, but he slowly walked to the stage, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Morgan extended a hand. Bob hesitated, his palm sweaty, but he shook it. The grip was firm, but not aggressive, and there was no anger or superiority in Morgan's eyes. The room erupted in applause, but Morgan raised a hand to quiet them. They sat at the table, and Morgan turned to Bob. "Officer Kelly," he said, his voice soft but piercing, "I want to ask you one thing. Why did you stop me?" Bob felt his throat tighten. He knew everyone was waiting for his answer. He could say something standard, repeat the line about protocol, about robberies, about instincts. But under Morgan's gaze, in the silence of the room, before himself, he felt those words would be hollow. I thought you might be suspicious," he said finally, his voice quiet and shaky. "It was my instinct. I saw you alone at night in that area, and I thought I'd better check." Morgan nodded, his gaze attentive but not judgmental. "And what did your instinct tell you?" he asked. "That an elderly man walking on the sidewalk was a threat, or something else?" Bob fell silent. The question hit its mark, and he felt the truth he'd long avoided rising to the surface. He thought of other stops, other suspicious individuals, and realized many shared a common trait. But admitting it out loud was harder than he'd imagined. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I didn't think about it. I just acted, like I always have." The room stirred, but Morgan raised a hand to quiet them. He placed a hand on Bob's shoulder, the gesture both supportive and a call to action. "That's the first step," Morgan said. "Admitting you don't know, but now you can learn. You can ask yourself, why do I act this way and not another? Why do my instincts tell me one thing and not another? And if you're willing to ask those questions, you're already on the path to change." Bob felt his eyes blur. He wasn't ready to call himself a hero or even a good person. But for the first time, he felt he could try. The room erupted in applause again, and this time it was not just for Morgan, but for the moment, fragile, imperfect, but real. Rosa returned to the stage to continue the forum, inviting others to share their stories. People spoke about their own experiences with police, their fears for their children, their hopes for a better future. Bob listened, and though he didn't speak again, his presence on the stage was enough. For many in the room, it was a sign that dialogue was possible, even when all bridges seemed burned. As the forum ended, people lingered, unwilling to leave. They stood in groups, talking, exchanging contacts, planning new meetings. Emily, who'd sat in the front row, approached Morgan afterward. "Do you really think he'll change?" she asked, nodding toward Bob, who was speaking with Rosa near the stage. Morgan smiled, his eyes twinkling with wisdom. "I don't know, Emily," he said, "but I know he heard, and that's more than we had yesterday." The weeks that followed were a trial Bob hadn't anticipated. After the forum, the department officially sidelined him from patrol, assigning him to desk duty and mandatory training on bias and cultural sensitivity. At first, Bob saw it as punishment, a way for the brass to save face with the press. He sat through the sessions, arms crossed, listening to facilitators who, he thought, didn't understand the realities of street work. But slowly, something began to shift. One trainer, a former cop named Raul, shared a story about stopping a young man for no reason, acting on instinct. The kid turned out to be a local pastor's son, and the fallout nearly cost Raul his job. But instead of firing him, the pastor invited him to dinner with his family. "That dinner changed me more than any training," Raul said, "because I saw that kid wasn't just a suspicious subject. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend." The story hit Bob hard. He started asking himself questions he'd avoided. Why did he stop some people more than others? Why did his instincts so often point to a certain type of suspect? He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he was willing to look for them. Bob also began reading, reluctantly at first, but with growing curiosity. Linda gave him a book on the history of racial bias in law enforcement, and though he initially dismissed it as liberal propaganda, some chapters made him pause. He watched documentaries Morgan recommended, including one on the civil rights movement. Images of protests, arrests, and human dignity under assault seared into his memory. But the most pivotal moment for Bob wasn't formal. One evening, after a training session, Raul invited him for coffee. They sat in a small diner, the air thick with the smell of fried bacon and strong coffee. Raul looked at Bob and said, "You know, I see myself in you. I used to think I wasn't a racist, that I was just doing my job. But the truth is, we all carry biases. The question is what we do with them." Bob nodded, his fingers gripping his mug. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted. "I want to be better, but it's hard." Raul smiled. "It's supposed to be hard. If it was easy, we'd all be perfect by now." That conversation was a turning point for Bob. He didn't become fixed or enlightened overnight, but he started listening. He noticed how his colleagues talked about problem areas or typical suspects, and for the first time, it made him uncomfortable. He began asking questions, engaging in conversations, even when they were awkward. And though he didn't always know what to say, he tried. Morgan, meanwhile, returned to his documentary, but wove the Atlanta incident into its narrative. He added scenes about dialogue, the power of conversation, and how one encounter could shift someone's perspective. He continued meeting with community leaders, students, police officers, and activists. His message remained unchanged: dialogue, not confrontation; understanding, not anger. Emily, inspired by the forum, decided to do more than talk. She approached the owner of her coffee shop and proposed hosting regular open discussion nights. The idea was simple. Once a month, people could come, share their stories, and discuss community issues. The owner, an older man named Joe, was skeptical at first, but agreed to give Emily a shot. The first night drew only 15 people, but for Emily, it was a victory. They sat at tables, sipped coffee, ate cookies, and talked about bias, about police, about making their neighborhood better. Emily invited Rosa as a guest speaker, and her presence drew attention. By the second night, 30 people showed up, and by the third, the room was packed. Emily also wrote to Bob, inviting him to one of the evenings. She didn't expect him to come, but 2 months later he did. He entered quietly, sat in the corner, and said nothing. But he listened. He listened as a young woman shared how her brother was stopped by police, as an older man recounted the 1960s, as Emily urged everyone to be brave in their conversations. When the evening ended, he approached her. "Thanks for the invite," he said, his voice low but sincere. I'm not where I want to be yet, but I'm trying." Emily smiled. "That's all we can do, Officer Kelly," she said. "We try." Months later, Morgan returned to Atlanta for the premiere of his documentary. The screening took place at the historic Fox Theater, a grand building with red velvet seats and gilded moldings. The auditorium was packed: students, activists, politicians, locals. Emily sat in the front row next to Rosa. Linda Gray was there, in uniform, representing the department. And, to many surprise, Bob Kelly sat in the back, in civilian clothes, almost invisible in the crowd. The film was powerful, a blend of archival footage, interviews, and Morgan's personal reflections. It didn't shy away from tough topics, but carried a tone of hope. In the final scene, Morgan spoke directly to the camera, his voice quiet but resonant. Change doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with small steps, a conversation, a question, a moment when you pause and ask, "Why do I think this way? Can I think differently?" And if we all take that step, we can change not just ourselves, but the world around us. When the lights came up, the room erupted in applause. People stood, cried, embraced. Morgan took the stage for a candid, and the first question came from a young student. "Mr. Freeman, do you believe one person can change the system?" Morgan smiled, his eyes finding Bob in the crowd. "One person can't change everything," he replied. "But one person can start. And if they start, others will follow. I've seen it here in Atlanta. I've seen it in the people who came together to talk, to listen, to learn. And I believe those people, all of you, can do more than I ever could." Bob felt his eyes blur. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even a good person, at least not in his own eyes. But he was a person trying, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As people left the theater, Atlanta's night air was cool, scented with a hint of jasmine and distant barbecue smoke. The streets hummed with life, laughter, chatter, car horns. Bob stood by the entrance, looking at the stars piercing through the city's glow. He didn't know what tomorrow held. He didn't know if he'd ever return to patrol, if he could earn the trust of those he'd wronged. But for the first time in a long time, he felt tomorrow could be better. Not perfect, not easy, but better. Emily, passing by, noticed him and stopped. "Nice night, huh?" she said, her voice light but genuine. Bob nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Yeah," he replied. "Nice night." They stood in silence, looking at the city living its life. And in that silence was something more than words, a sense of possibility, of hope, of a beginning.